Hello ဒီနေ့ရဲ့မိနစ်30စာဖတ်တဲ့အခါမှာဘာပြောမလဲဆိုလို့ရှိရင် consciousness လို့ခေါ်တဲ့သိစိတ်အကြောင်းအဲ့တော့မိနစ်30တာမှတ်မယ်ပြီးတော့တူစာဖတ်မယ် Let's go We know the meaning of consciousness so long as no one asks us to define it by William James. သိစိတ်ရဲ့အဓိပ္ပာယ်ကိုသိနေတာကြာလာပြီဖြစ်တဲ့အတွက်ကြောင့်မလို့ဘယ်သူမှဒီဟာရဲ့အဓိပ္ပာယ်ကိုပြောပြဖို့မခိုင်းတော့ဘူး The term consciousness is generally used to refer to an individual's awareness of his or her own thoughts, including sensations, feelings, and memories. We usually take this awareness for granted, except when we're having difficulties, such as trying to do something when we're very tired. But if you focus your thoughts on your consciousness, you soon become aware that your consciousness experiences are constantly changing. While reading this book, for example, you may be reminded of past experiences or present discomforts that interrupt your concentration. Plans for the future may spontaneously spring to mind. Thinking about your conscious experiences makes you realize just how much your thoughts are changing, and yet they seem to come together, merging and carrying on smoothly as a whole. American psychologist William James compared these everyday experiences of consciousness to a stream that continuously flows despite the odd interruption and change of direction. He declared, a river or a stream are the metaphors by which it is most naturally described. In talking of it hereafter, let us call it the stream of thought, of consciousness. James's famous description of the stream of consciousness is one that almost everyone can identify with, because we all experience it. Yet, at the same time, James points out that it is very hard to actually define. When I say every thought is part of a personal consciousness is one of the terms in question. To give an accurate account of it is the most difficult of philosophic tasks. This most difficult of philosophic tasks has a long history. The ancient Greeks discussed the mind, but did not use the term consciousness or any equivalent. However, there was debate as to whether something separate from the body exists at all. In the 4th century BCE, Plato made a distinction between the soul and the body, but Aristotle argued that even if there is a distinction, the two cannot be separated. Early definitions. René Descartes, in the mid-17th century, was one of the first philosophers to attempt to describe consciousness proposing that it resides in an immaterial domain he called the realm of thought, in contrast to the physical domain of material things, which he called the realm of extension. However, the first person accredited with the modern concept of consciousness as an ongoing passage of individual perceptions is the 17th century English philosopher John Locke. James was drawn to Locke's idea of passing perceptions and also to the work of the 17th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant was impressed by the way our experiences come together, noting that if we hear a noise and feel pain at the same time, we typically experience these as one event. He called this the unity of consciousness, a concept that influenced many later philosophers, including William James. James felt the most important point about consciousness is that it's not a thing, but a process. It is what the brain does to steer a nervous system grown too complex to regulate itself. It allows us to reflect upon the past, present, and future, to plan and adapt to circumstances, and so fulfill what he believed was the prime purpose of consciousness, to stay alive. But James found it hard to imagine the structure of a unified consciousness. He likened it to a group of 12 men. Take a dozen words, take 12 men, and to each give one word. Then stand the men in a row of jam and let each think of his word as intently as he will. Nowhere will there be a consciousness of the whole sentence. If consciousness is a stream of distinct thoughts, James struggled to see how these combine. As he said, the idea of a plus, the idea of B is not identical with the idea of A plus B. Two thoughts added together cannot be made into one idea. They are more likely to form an entirely new idea. For example, if thought A is it's 9 o'clock and thought B is the train leaves at 9:02, thought C, I'm going to miss my train, might follow. Combining thoughts. James concluded that the simplest way to understand how thoughts within the stream of consciousness might combine to make sense is to suppose the things that are known together are known in single pulses of that stream. Some thoughts or sensations, he believed, are unavoidably connected, like Kant's example of hearing a noise and feeling pain at precisely at the same time, because any thoughts that enter our awareness during the same moment of time combine to form a pulse or a current within the stream. We may have many of these currents flowing through our consciousness, some fast and some slow. James stated that there is even resting points where we pause to form pictures in our minds, which can be held and contemplated at length. He called the resting places substantive parts and the moving currents the transitive parts, claiming that our thinking is constantly being dislodged from one substantive part towards another, propelled by the transitive parts or current. We are, therefore, effectively bumped from one conclusion to another by the constant stream of thoughts, whose purpose is to pull us ever forward in this way. There is no final conclusion. Consciousness is not a thing but a process which is constantly evolving. James also drew attention to the personal nature of consciousness, stating that thoughts do not exist independently of a thinker. They are your thoughts or mine. Each one is owned by someone and never comes into direct sight of a thought in another personal consciousness than its own. And it is these thoughts, connected as we feel them to be connected, that form the self. As thoughts cannot be divided from the self, James said that investigating this self should be the starting point of psychology. Experimental psychologists do not agree because the self cannot be offered up for experimentation. But James thought it was enough to work with our understanding of a self that does contain certain things and feels in certain ways. He called this the empirical self, which manifests itself through its behavior, and suggested that it consists of several parts: the material self, spiritual self, and social self, each of which can be studied through introspection. Now let's talk about theory of emotion. In the early stages of his research into consciousness, James realized that the emotions played an important role in our daily lives, and went on to develop, with his colleague Carl Lange, a theory about how they relate to our actions and behavior. What was to become known as the James Lange theory of emotion states that emotions arise from your conscious mind's perception of your psychological condition. To illustrate this theory, James used the example of seeing a bear, then running away. It's not the case that you see the bear, feel afraid, and then run away because of the fear. What's really happening is that you see the bear and run away, and the conscious feeling of fear is caused by the action of running. This contradicts what most people might think, but James' view was that the mind's perception of the physical effects of running, rapid breathing, increased heartbeat, and perspiring heavily, is translated into the emotion of fear. Another example, according to his theory, would be that you feel happy because you're conscious that you're smiling. It's not that you feel happy first and then smile. So maybe that's why people say if you smile, then you feel happy. Isn't it right? Now, moving on to pragmatism. Related to James' theory about consciousness is his approach to the way we believe things to be true or not. He stated that, short quote, truths emerge from facts, but the facts themselves are not true. They simply are. Truth is a function of the beliefs that start and terminate among them. End quote. James defined, quote unquote, true beliefs as those that the believer finds useful. This emphasis on the usefulness of beliefs lies at the heart of American philosophical tradition of pragmatism, which was central to James's thinking. In the course of our lives, James claimed that we're continually testing, quote unquote, truths against each other, and our conscious beliefs keep changing as, quote unquote, old truths are modified and sometimes replaced by, quote unquote, new truths. This theory is particularly relevant to the way that all scientific research, including psychology, progresses. James cited the discovery of the radioactive element radium by Parry and Marie Curie in 1902 as an example. In the course of their investigations, the Curies found that radium appeared to give off unlimited amounts of energy, which Starkey seemed for a moment to contradict our ideas of the whole order of nature. End quote. However, after conscious consideration of this revelation, they concluded that, Starkey, although it extends our old ideas of energy, it causes a minimum of alternation in their nature. End quote. In this instance, the Curie's scientific knowledge had been questioned and modified, but its core truths remained intact. So it means that if we find something new, but if it doesn't change our knowledge of or perception of the world, then it doesn't add up to something. Now, further studies. The period following James's death saw the rise of the behaviorist movement and a decline of interest in consciousness. Consequently, little theorizing on the subject happened from around the start of the 1920s up until the 1950s. One important exception was the German-based Gestalt movement, which emphasized that the brain operates in a holistic way, means the whole way, taking accounts of whole conscious experiences rather than separate events. Just as when we look at a picture, we see not just separate dots, lines, and shapes, but a meaningful whole. This concept is behind the now famous Gestalt phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Since the 1980s, however, psychologists and neuroscientists have developed a new field of research called, quote unquote, consciousness studies, focusing on two main areas of interest, which are the content of consciousness as reported by people who are considered to be normal and healthy, and the consciousness of people whose state of awareness has been impaired in some way. So the healthy consciousness and not so healthy consciousness, I would say. The latter group includes cases such as when the subject is in a quote-unquote persistent vegetative state, PVS, in which patients in coma are awake and breathing independently, but apparently lost all higher brain functions. Means they cannot think, they cannot they cannot execute bodily functions like moving, feelings, and stuff. The goal with which both parts of research is to try to find ways of assessing consciousness as objectively as possible and to understand its underlying mechanisms, both physical and psychological. Modern neuroscience has demonstrated that there are mechanisms of consciousness. By the closing years of the 20th century, the British molecular biologist and biophysicist Francis Crick was claiming that consciousness is related to a specific part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex area, which is involved in thought processes such as planning, problem solving, and the control of behavior. Research carried out by the Colombian neuroscientist Rodolfo Linares links consciousness to the activities of the thalamus in conjunction with the cerebral cortex. The thalamus, a structure embedded deep in the center of the brain, is responsible for regulating vibrations inside the brain at certain frequencies. If these regular rhythms are disrupted by an infection or genetic causes, then an individual may experience neurological disorders such as epilepsy and Parkinson's disease, as well as psychological conditions such as depression. But when it comes to definitions of consciousness, modern attempts still remain vague and difficult to apply. For example, the American neuroscientist Antonio Damasio calls consciousness, quote, the feeling of what happens, end quote, and defines it as, quote, an organism's awareness of its own self and its surroundings, end quote. As William James suggested, more than 100 years later, consciousness is hard to define. Now, moving on to what happens after lasting legacy. An edited version of James's 1890 book, The Principles of Psychology, is still in print, and his ideas have been a major influence on many psychologists, as well as other scientists and thinkers. The application of his pragmatic philosophy to facts, concentrating not on what is true about but what is useful to believe, has helped psychology move on from the question of whether the mind and the body are separate or not to a more useful study of mental processes such as attention, memory, reasoning, imagination, and intention. James claimed that this approach helped to move philosophers and psychologists, quote, away from abstraction, fixed principles, closed systems, and pretended absolutes and origins towards facts, action, and power, end quote. His insistence on focusing on the wholeness of events, including the effects of different environments on our actions, In contrast to the introspective, structuralist approach of breaking down our experiences into small details, has also shaped our understanding of behavior. Before James started teaching the subject at Harvard in 1875, there was no independent psychology courses available in any American university. But within 20 years, around 24 colleges and universities in the US had recognized psychology as a distinct academic discipline and were offering degrees in that subject. 3 specialist psychology journals were also founded in that time, and a professional organization, the American Psychological Association, APA, was formed. James introduced the experimental psychology to America, despite claiming to, quote, hate experimental work, end quote. He did so because he had come to realize that it was the best way to prove or disprove a theory. But he continued to value the use of introspection as a tool of discovery, especially of mental processes. The shift in the perception of psychology and its concerns from being considered, quote, a nasty little subject in James's word, end quote, into a vastly beneficial discipline owes much to his work. In 1977, in a speech celebrating the 75th anniversary of the formation of the APA, American Psychological Association, David Craig, then professor of Emeritus in Psychology at the University of California at Berkeley, referred to James as the father of psychology. So let me end this reading with a quote from William James. All these consciousnesses melt into each other like dissolving views. Properly, they are but one protracted consciousness, one unbroken stream. That's it, folks. That's the end of our William James's analysis of consciousness. So he said that the consciousness is a stream. It's not separately defined. It cannot be separately defined, and it's useless to define it. Which makes us move on to further useful studies of the aspects of our mind. Great, so see you in the next video, I guess. Bye bye.